13 terrifying stories that will keep you awake at night. 1. The Vanishing Cabin. In the dense Appalachian forests, a hiker named Daniel stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The structure was in pristine condition, as if frozen in time. Curiosity got the best of him, and he stepped inside. Dust covered the wooden floor, yet a fresh cup of tea sat steaming on the table. His skin prickled as he realized he wasn't alone. A whisper echoed through the air, but when he turned around, the door was gone. The walls shifted, and the cabin seemed to stretch infinitely. He ran for what felt like hours until he collapsed. When he awoke, he was outside, covered in deep scratches. The cabin had disappeared, as if it had never existed. 2. The Mirror That Watches. Lena found an ornate mirror at an antique shop, its frame carved with unfamiliar symbols. At first, it seemed like any other antique, but soon, odd things began happening. She would see movements in the reflection that didn't match her own. Shadows lingered at the edges, watching. One night, she noticed her reflection smiling, while she wasn't. Frozen in horror, she couldn't move as her mirrored self stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. A crack formed, spreading like spiderwebs. The last thing she saw before the room turned black was her reflection reaching out to pull her in. 3. The Whispering Woods. Near a sleepy town, there was a stretch of forest locals avoided after dark. They called it the Whispering Woods. A teenager named Mark ignored the warnings and ventured inside on a dare. At first, it was just the sound of wind rustling the leaves. Then, he heard whispers, urgent, pleading. Shadows darted between the trees, their voices growing louder. He tried to run, but the forest closed in around him. The next morning, his friends found his shoes at the forest's edge. He was never seen again, but on still nights, the wind carried the sound of his voice, calling for help. 4. The Phone Call from the Dead. Emma's phone rang at exactly 3:13 a.m. The number was her sister's, but that was impossible. Her sister had died 2 years ago. Shaking, she answered. Static filled the line, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Help me, it's cold." Emma's heart pounded as the voice grew clearer. "I need you to find me." The call ended abruptly. The next day, she visited her sister's grave. Fresh dirt had been disturbed. With trembling hands, she dug and found a phone clutched in skeletal fingers, her sister's phone. A final message blinked on the screen, "I'm not alone." 5. The Room That Wasn't There. Jake moved into a new apartment, cheap because of its strange layout. A locked door in the hallway caught his curiosity. The landlord insisted it led to nothing, but one night, Jake heard knocking from the other side. He pried the door open and found a fully furnished room, one that hadn't been there before. An old radio crackled to life, playing a song from decades past. Then, the furniture began shifting as if unseen hands were moving them. The door slammed shut behind him. The next morning, his apartment was normal again, except the door had vanished, and so had he. 6. The Man in the Fog. Driving home late one night, Sarah's car broke down on a desolate road. A thick fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. As she waited for help, she noticed a figure emerging from the mist. He wore a suit, but his face was blurred, as if reality couldn't quite hold him in focus. He moved unnaturally, jerking closer with each blink. Panicking, she locked the doors, but he was suddenly at her window, tapping lightly. The fog thickened, swallowing him whole. When the tow truck arrived, the driver found Sarah unconscious, her windows covered in handprints, inside and out. 7. The House That Remembers. The old mansion at the end of Hollow Street had been abandoned for years. Claire and her friends decided to explore it for fun. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with whispers. They split up, laughing, until the laughter stopped. One by one, they vanished. Claire found herself alone, the walls shifting around her. She heard footsteps, her own, replaying from moments before. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on memories and trapping those who dared to enter. The next morning, the mansion was empty again, as if no one had ever been there. But if you listen closely, you could hear them, trapped in the walls, forever calling for help. 8. The shadow behind the door. Ever since moving into her new home, Kelly felt uneasy about the basement door. It was always slightly ajar, no matter how many times she shut it. One night, she heard shuffling noises coming from below. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and shone a flashlight down. A shadowy figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at her with glowing eyes. Paralyzed, she watched as it moved forward without making a sound. The door slammed shut on its own. The next morning, the basement door was gone, as if it had never been there. 9. The doll that cried. Mia's grandmother left her an old porcelain doll, its eyes too lifelike for comfort. At night, she swore she heard faint sobbing coming from the doll's direction. One evening, she placed it in a locked cabinet, determined to prove she was imagining things. But at 3 a.m., she woke up to soft, muffled cries. The cabinet door was wide open, and the doll ate. The shadow behind the door. Ever since moving into her new home, Kelly felt uneasy about the basement door. It was always slightly ajar, no matter how many times she shut it. One night, she heard shuffling noises coming from below. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and shone a flashlight down. A shadowy figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at her with glowing eyes. Paralyzed, she watched as it moved forward without making a sound. The door slammed shut on its own. The next morning, the basement door was gone, as if it had never been there. 10. The midnight visitor. Lucas often woke up to the sound of footsteps outside his bedroom. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. But one night, he left his phone recording while he slept. The next morning, he played the audio. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the room, followed by whispering. Then, a chilling voice murmured his name. He never slept in that room again. 11. The woman in the painting. At an estate sale, Henry bought an old painting of a woman in Victorian attire. The seller warned him never to place it in his bedroom. Ignoring the warning, he hung it across from his bed. That night, he woke up to the sound of rustling fabric. The woman in the painting was no longer seated, she was standing, her eyes following him. The next morning, the painting was gone, but the woman's footprints led from his bedroom to the front door. 12. The train that never comes. Every night at 3 a.m., residents near an abandoned train station heard the sound of a locomotive passing. The tracks had been decommissioned for decades, yet the noise persisted. A group of ghost hunters set up cameras and recorded a spectral train pulling into the station. On board, shadowy figures peered through the fogged windows, their mouths moving silently as if screaming for help. 13. The Whispering Mask. At a carnival, Emily found an eerie white mask at a vendor's booth. She bought it on impulse, only to hear faint whispers whenever she was near it. One night, she put it on as a joke and couldn't take it off. Her screams echoed through the house as the mask tightened, fusing to her skin. The next morning, all that remained was the mask on her bed, whispering her name to anyone who dared to listen.